Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Earthdawn Survival Guide, a podcast for novices and masters alike. I am Dan. My co-host is, of course, the Earthdawn line developer, Josh Harrison.
Good evening, everyone.
On this podcast, we'll be discussing all things Earthdawn, both magical and mechanical. If you'd like to get a hold of us and ask us any questions, you can contact us at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. This episode, we're going to cover a couple things. To start with, I think we talked about it earlier, not even offline. What is your elevator pitch? You're the line developer. What is your elevator pitch to somebody who's never played Earthdawn before, or you're trying to pull them away from their D&D game?
I actually wanted to pitch this to you initially and say, if you were going to give somebody an elevator pitch, what would you... Because I have been, of course, selling this game at conventions and stuff for a while, so I have a pretty practiced one, but I would want to hear what your elevator pitch. What is Earthdawn, if you had to sum it up in basically just a sentence or two?
Oh, a sentence or two. I've given elevator pitches before.
We'll get into the broader stuff in a little bit, but totally. If you were to, the idea of the elevator pitch being you are basically you are trying to sell someone on an idea over the length of an elevator ride, basically.
I've done it before in a very few simple words to diehard D&Ders. Where I say Earthdawn is D&D done better.
Okay.
In every way possible.
Yeah, I've heard D&D done right as well.
I used to say done right, but I said D&D done better. Because every game I figure can almost stand on its own in some cases, but I figure Earthdawn is D&D done better. Magically better. Socially better. Skills and talents better, setting better, because D&D never had a setting, so I at least get them with that one. So Earthdawn is D&D with an actual defined setting versus Dragonlance versus Waterdeep versus Dark Sun versus Forgotten Realms versus anything else, Ravenloft. So I figure if I can just hook people into, this is a defined setting, I can tell you where you are, when you are, and how you are, and I can tell you why you progress, and I can tell you why all those dungeons exist, why all those underground places exist, and I have a story to go along with all of it. And I will take your first circle Earthdawn character up against a 5th level D&D character, and I'll mop the floor with them.
Okay.
So in my 30 to 45 seconds elevator pitch, that's usually what I get people to hook them. This is what I got.
Yeah, that's good. That's not bad.
Fair. What's yours?
I don't use this one, but before I get into mine, the one that I have heard sort of most often taking the the idea of you make your elevator pitch as like a mashup of two things. And the idea, the one that I've heard sort of presented most often is Dungeons and Dragons meets Fallout.
Okay. I can see that.
Yeah. Or fantasy Fallout is another one where you've got the vaults, the cares, and people emerging from them and discovering sort of the new world after this kind of apocalyptic scenario.
Oh, totally.
The way that I usually pitch it, if I'm sort of trying to define it, which is I call Earthdawn a hopeful post-apocalyptic high fantasy.
There you go. I like that.
Because
I never even I didn't quite understand the post-apocalyptic part because I didn't equate the scourge with an apocalypse. I just looked at it as this thing happened, these bad things happen, and then we come back. And so I looked at it as the rebirth from that, not necessarily post-apocalypse, because I was assuming the apocalypse is like nuclear, but that's just me.
Yeah.
So, and then recently I've come across people call it the horrors Lovecraftian. And I didn't see them as such. I just saw them as, they're evil, they're nasty, they're wicked. But then again, a lot of things are. So,
yeah, there's a distinction. I can certainly understand the Lovecraftian angle, which is to say that you're talking about powerful, mysterious, extra-dimensional entities whose motives, and that sort of thing. You've got powerful, especially with the more powerful horrors. The ones that are campaign level opponents, Vergegorm and the like, can certainly put them on a par with entities like Great Cthulhu and whatnot. But I think the key difference, and the one that I like to stress whenever that comes up in a discussion, is that one of the core conceits of Lovecraftian horror when it comes to the mythos is that a lot of these entities really don't care about humanity in any respect. Like, they are so far beyond the understanding of humanity that their motives and whatnot are just inscrutable, and they do stuff that messes with people not for any kind of real evil, but just because that's the way they are. Whereas the horrors, especially the more powerful ones, are very interested in people, because people, at least as the general belief is, produce the thing that they need to survive.
Yeah, they feed on us.
Yes. And so there is a much more, like, I would say probably the Lovecraftian entity that is closest in concept to the horrors is probably Nyarlathotep, who is the only one of the Lovecraftian pantheon that really seems to have any kind of interest or stake in humanity in terms of getting involved with them. But
fair.
But yeah, the fantasy post-apocalypse, and the reason I throw the hopeful in there is that there is very distinctively, like, it has ended, we are rebuilding, we are reclaiming the world, and while there is darkness out there,
we're eradicating it.
We are we are fighting against it. It is not a typical, like, Mad Max style post-apocalypse where people are just simply struggling to survive and kind of a almost every man for themselves aspect. But this is, I mean, there can be that in Earthdawn, but it's more like we are rebuilding civilization, or bringing, not even necessarily rebuilding it, because there was a lot, as we will cover in this show when we get into the history and whatnot, there were plans and things that were done to help ensure that would happen, that when the scourge was over, there actually would be a civilization to rebuild.
Yes. So what we know Earthdawn is not is Mad Max. I'm just kidding. So we've got two nice elevator pitches for people to use on if they're going to ever try and convince their D&D friends or any other gamers to come in and come play Earthdawn. So yeah, I like both of those elevator pitches. Yeah. So I'm good with that. So let's get down to some other topics real quick. We're going to cover 3 or 4 things and then get out of your hair, folks. So the overall setting. So as we said, it's kind of post-apocalyptic, but it has hope to it. What else about the setting should we let people know how to survive in Earthdawn? Because there's the Death Sea, there's the mist, the mist swamps.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of that sort of like setting detail, but when I am like trying to, again, drawing on my experience from running demos at conventions and stuff like that, I generally, when I am trying to explain the concept of the game to people who are sitting down to play it for the first time, I try not to get into some of that setting minutia unless it's relevant to the adventure, and then I will cover it when it comes up.
Yes. Yeah.
So I generally like take the really high concept, which is to say, magic runs in cycles. There are high points and low points. At high points, the barrier between worlds grows thin, and nasty, vicious, demonic type entities from the darkest reaches of the universe are able to cross into the world and cause all sorts of untold pain and destruction. Fortunately, as the most recent high point was approaching, there was warning that these things were coming, and insufficient time for the wizards and those knowledgeable in magic to basically prepare protections against them. Unfortunately, while there wasn't any way to prevent them from arriving, the best protection was basically to build magical underground bomb shelters called cares, which they would seal and hide away from these beings, which they called the horrors, for the centuries that they would be active and present in the world. And then once the magic level had crested its high point and dropped back down enough that they would retreat back to their native realm, people could open their shelters, which were called cares, reemerge into the world, and get on with life. The game is set in the aftermath of this period, about 100 years after, so not every... the world has been radically altered from what people, from what the legends and maps and old stories remember from centuries ago. But for the most part, cities are rebuilt. Connections between towns and settlements are reopening. There are still isolated and dark places on the map, some places that really suffered at the hands of the horrors, and for some reason, nobody's really quite sure why, magic stopped dropping. And so there are some horrors that are still lurking in the darker, places of the world. And you play characters that are basically helping to rediscover the secrets of the world of the past and to, help fight against those who, either the horrors or those who would try and take advantage of the scattered and sometimes isolated settlements to further their own ends.
In a nutshell.
That's entirely basically it. And everything, everything beyond that is like detail, and it's fantastic detail, but you don't need, you don't really need to get into the specifics of. Yeah, it's like, here's the concept. You play you play heroes, you play adventurers who are going out and basically fighting against, against the dark stuff. And it's maybe the horrors. It may be, it may be bandits or slavers or other people that are seeking to, elevate themselves over
a town, or
over a town, or to hold some kind of power or influence, or to control other people. There is, even back in the first edition days, a very sort of freedom based concept to the game.
Yes.
The idea, basically taking a strong anti-slavery stance, kind of from the beginning, and things like that. And again, stuff that we'll get into more detail as we dive into more specific aspects, but
totally.
It is it is intended as a heroic, and maybe sometimes dark, but ultimately hopeful setting, where you are acting as a light in the darkness and hopefully inspiring others to do the same.
I agree. I also have on occasion likened it to Indiana Jones.
Yeah, there can be,
you're out there trying to dig up some treasures on occasion, figure things out, put them in their proper places, keep them out of the hands of the bad guys, and the bad guys are outnumbering you, overwhelming you, and are really difficult to fight as a whole, as an entire entity. So every once in a while, I've been able to convince somebody that it's kind of Indiana Jones-ish. So less Mad Max, more Indiana Jones.
Yeah, there can definitely be some of that, and you take, and again, there's the darkness, but you take your victories where you can. That you may not be able to ultimately, defeat all of the horrors, but maybe you can, free this one village from its torment.
Absolutely.
And then you move on to the next, and bit by bit, and that while you as a single adventurer might not be able to do everything, if you are doing these good works, then maybe other people with the capability will be inspired to go and do that as well, and eventually,
do the
drive
same thing.
back the tide,
or join you if you are doing it by yourself. Yeah, so you can go from there. So that being said, the Indiana Jones-ish or the inspiring people, the goal of Earthdawn is different than most other games, as far as I can come across, because I could never figure out the point of D&D. I'm kind of like, so I go along, I fight stuff, I get, experience points. Whoop-de-doo. What does that do me? Well, you get to go up the hills. And what does that do me? Whereas Earthdawn, there's a secondary point to all of that adventuring and points, which is you get to build your legend. You get to become famous. They sing songs about you. They remember you for generations and so forth. And that, I think, is a different because we all like to tell stories and we all want to be as famous as we can be if we're playing video games and whatnot. We don't have the high score in the arcade game, things like that. But that's different. This is people get to talk about you. And so you get to build your actual legend and go, yeah, I not only did these things, I'm also Seventh Circle, whatever the case may be, and I have this cool little treasure, but I am known far and wide across the land as the slayer of X, Y, and Z. So I think that's a cool little aspect I get to sell people on as well.
Yeah, that's I think, to take a slight tangent here, I think that stories are important. I think the stories that we tell ourselves are incredibly important, that they shape who we are as individuals and as a culture.
Agreed.
And having a game that, at least in some respects, pays attention and homage to that. It is not as like in-depth sort of as some indie, like smaller, more focused games are, because while that objective of building your legend and becoming famous is important to the game, Earthdawn is still in some respects a traditional game, along the lines of like Dungeons and Dragons and things like that.
Yes.
In that basically you play adventurers who are going out and exploring ruins, or slaying monsters, or fighting villains who are trying to perform, who are trying to enact their nefarious plots. Like those are sort of traditional adventuring tasks. But there is a theme that is present in the setting material that is implicit to the whole endeavor, and that is the idea of building your legend. There's I forget the exact quote and I don't have it handy, but it's from one of the early books. I think it might even be the quote at the beginning of the character creation chapter in the first edition core book, but it's basically a quote from King Varolus of Thrall, who is saying, basically we call them heroes in hopes that they become so. There's more to the quote, but that's basically the idea.
Yeah.
Behind it. And so I like that idea of the story and the thematic goals of the game. Again, even if they're not necessarily explicit, but something that kind of always runs as an undercurrent to what's going on and how a lot of the setting material is presented in the books.
Well, and I like the aspect, because I don't think I've come across this in any other game either, that not only do you get to maybe sometimes find a legend or hear about the legend, because to your point, the stories are incredibly important, but you get to add yours to it. So if you find this legendary item and you do deeds with it, then you get to tie your legend to it. And so after you die, because eventually everybody does die, if somebody finds that again, then your legend is tied to that and they get to learn about you. And that's not inherent in any other game I've come across either. So that's another little telling point of the whole thing. So, because we can't tell the Ark of the Covenant story without Indiana Jones now at the end.
Sure. And there are aspects of the game mechanics that are a lot more explicitly tied into that, specifically thread items, which we will cover in a later episode. Don't you worry.
Oh, it's coming.
We will might touch on it. Actually, well, we can sort of lead that into some of the concepts that are unique. Not unique, but that are special to Earthdawn in terms of how you approach it, especially if you're coming to it from a more Dungeons and Dragons origin.
Yes.
Or if you're new to games in general, just some things that are a little bit different in Earthdawn compared to what you might have seen in other like fantasy games, whether Dungeons and Dragons or the Dragon Age games from Green Ronin, stuff like that.
So, threading that.
Oh, and we should mention here, both of us are kind of like getting over colds, so we're doing our best, but you'll be hearing a lot of like coughs and suppressed whatever. And I'm not quite doing my my Russell Zimmerman voice, but I'm a little bit on the gravelly side tonight.
You and me both. My voice will change. You'll hear 3 different versions of my voice tonight. So one gravelly, one after the cough, and one normal when I get there. So we're getting there eventually. So that being said, we've got 3 or 4 concepts just to kind of go over in general tonight, and we're going to get down into the agenda of specific episodes as we go on. We've got them all listed out, I think, for next 12 or 13. So something like that.
Yeah, something like
that.
We'll
cover all the disciplines, all the races.
There is plenty of material. So
yes, and then that also listener feedback. So by all means, drop us a line.
Yeah. If you've got stuff that you want us to dive into, by all means, let us know.
Absolutely.
And we can shift things around so that we can talk about what people want to hear first. But of course, exactly. Our first real broad concept game basics episode should cover this broad stuff. So
we're working on the elevator pitch and how to get people to play in your Earthdawn game. Any version. We don't care if it's 4th edition. We prefer 4th edition, but anything will do.
It's a lot easier to find the books, but...
That too, yes. But by all means, get them in the door. So we've got 3 broad concepts to cover tonight that we kind of covered the setting a little bit of the history, and the elevator pitch. Since we were just speaking about legends and how important they are and how you get to tie your legend to the other items you find and or the group patterns and so forth. Do we want to talk about threads first? Legendary threads type thing?
Yeah, why don't we talk about thread items. One of the things that was definitely sort of unique or noteworthy for Earthdawn when it was initially released was the way that it approached magic items.
I agree, because I didn't come across this at all in D&D. It was just one of those...
You certainly would not have come across it much in D&D in the early 90s, which was the heyday of the 2nd edition era. You sort of had it maybe a little bit when you were talking about some of the artifacts from Dungeons & Dragons, yes. Like the Rod of 7 Parts and...
Staff of the Magi.
The Apparatus of Qualish and, things like that, where you had unique... very powerful items that had a name and a history and stuff like that. But for the most part, unless your game master sort of went a little bit above and beyond and provided that, a lot of times you're it's a, you found a +2 sword. Or, you've got the boots of Elvenkind, which were all sort of just the same sort of stuff.
Yes.
Earthdawn kind of took that artifact approach and applied it to all items, which is to say that when you find a magic sword in an abandoned care, you have not just found a +1 sword. You have found smoke, which was the sword that was wielded by, last known to be wielded by the warrior, this dude. We are so well prepared. I'm just
Lothar of the Hill People. Yeah, him.
Yeah,
him.
And that even just picking up that item at first in your hands, it just behaves as a normal sword. It is magical, but you haven't unlocked its power. Once you start learning about the item, and the more you learn about the item, the stronger your bond to that item can be, and the more powerful it will become. Mm-hmm. And so rather than, I found a +1 sword, 2 levels of adventuring later, here's a +2 sword, +1 sword goes on the weapons rack, never to be used again.
Yeah, or I'll just sell it to the nearest
your magic items, your thread items, have names and histories, and they grow along with your character as you learn their story and your story kind of intertwines with theirs. Mm-hmm. The items get more powerful. Now, things like this have shown up in later designs, as we talked about in our last episode. A lot of that back and forth influence where people doing design in the early 2000s, taking inspiration from games from the previous decade, that you have things like in D&D, legacy weapons, I think they were called, depending on who put them out in the D20 OGL sort of original version. There were 3 or 4 different versions of them that came out, I think.
Yes.
But the idea that you have an item that grows and expands with your character rather than being disposable once its bonuses aren't high enough to allow you to hit the monsters you're fighting.
Yeah.
The other thing that these items do is allow you in a way to build story arcs in your campaign, because ideally what you do is the group discovers that in order to, you know, unlock the next level of power in the sword that they found, they need to learn, you know, the name of the weaponsmith who created it. And that's not necessarily something that you can just go to the library and flip open the encyclopedia and get the answer.
Yes.
You need to, oh, well, the mark that's here on the hilt is this symbol. And, oh, well, when we do research, it looks like that symbol ties into this old kingdom that was from the before. So we're going to have to travel there and see if we can find, you know, somebody who knows, or, you know, that kind of thing, where you can build story arcs is sort of interweaving throughout your campaign, where you have adventures that are focused on, you know, unlocking the power of your magical items.
Yeah, I like the fact that Earthdawn makes you earn it, and it's not just video game disposable. Oh, I'm going to drop this one because that one's better. And you just kind of walk off. This one, as you said, you can tie a story into it. And I always relate this to people. I'm like, well, okay, you've heard of Excalibur, haven't you? Mm-hmm. That's the lead in. Oh, guess what? This sword is better than Excalibur. You just need to go earn it. And you need to figure out the history about it, who had it last, who made it, where it was discarded, blah, blah, blah. And you need to know that the Lady in the Lake was there, and it was King Arthur, and so forth and so on, in the Earthdawn parlance. But Earthdawn makes you earn it. And I appreciate that, because it's, as I said, not just video game disposable about every single thing you find.
Yeah.
So
now,
go do your research.
Let me be fair.
Yes.
It is not required that you
No.
have every single magic item that the group uses or finds require its own, like, campaign level arc in order to unlock its power. That is not required. I think you're losing something by not having some aspects of that in the game, but, you know, characters will have multiple items, and if you focus all of your stories on getting the knowledge of those items, you know, you may be missing out on other stuff, unless you're doing some really, like, epic level crafting and weaving the history of those items in with your campaign's plot, like I've tried to do a couple of times, you know, and things like that, so that the items knowledge and so forth can be learned as your campaign storyline progresses. A great thing actually to look at for this, and probably one of the best adventures in Earthdawn, is it's actually an adventure collection from first edition called Blades.
Yes.
Which is basically a textbook example of, here is a magic item, here are the like, basically, and here are adventures that are tied into learning each of the items, each of the things you need to know as you progressively get the item, and it forms its own sort of mini campaign that you can weave in and out that also kind of progresses the storyline of what's going on in the setting. So, you know, if you are not familiar with that, that is a fantastic book to pick up, and to get a real primer on what is possible with that system.
Cue 75 people putting pause on the podcast, going to eBay and picking up Blades right now.
They can go to eBay, or they can get it in PDF. They can give us the money instead of some third-party seller.
Right. Forget eBay. I didn't mention that at all. Go to FossilGames.com.
I mean, if you want a print copy, you will need to go to eBay. Correct. And actually, Earthdawn stuff doesn't tend to be that expensive on eBay if you're willing to wait around. But you know, it's available in PDF. And not that expensive at all, so definitely worth.
And I've
worth
taken my
tracking
PDFs to a local binding store whose name will remain anonymous. Just go print it up there, 10 cents a page, and you can get them all done. So we go from there. So that, by the way, the legends and the threads there with the items pivots into the overall broad concept of magic as a whole, as an entirety in the game, which I think is also a little bit different from D&D, where maybe your wizard had to go out and collect all the bat guano to make your fireball spell work, which I just found tedious. And I'm like, really? I have to do that? This is more of I think, in my own view, it's personally a mental tapping into the fabric of the universe, and I can collect the magical energies that I need, focus them, harness them into the right
shape.
Pattern. Yeah, I was going to go along
Pattern.
with that. I used to call it a quilt. Right, pattern for it, and then I can make that spell happen. And so it's more Harry Potter than it is D&D. I don't have to have a wand necessarily or a focus object all the time, but it's just I looked at it as you know how this works. It's like the lyrics to a song. You just need to sing them in the right order, and everyone can get what it means, and you can get the spell out properly, and it'll do what you want it to do.
Yep, and not only that. I mean, you're talking about sort of traditional, magician wizard style spell casting.
Yes, that was where I was starting.
That was where we were starting. But sort of beyond that, all of the player character classes, for lack of a better term, which are in the game, are called disciplines, if you weren't aware.
Yes.
Are
going to stay with that.
Magical. Is that all, because the game's setting concept is so heavily focused on magic. I mean, magic is the reason that things happened the way they did in terms of the scourge and the need to hide away from the horrors. But all of the great heroes and the player characters wanting to be great heroes are these as well, are adepts, which means that they all use magic. Not just the wizard or the elementalist who cast more traditional spells, but everybody does. Your frontline warrior at the front with sword and shield is using magic to make his skin tougher, and to move faster than his opponent, and to strike harder with his blade. It's just that he's using his magic to focus along a particular path, and that's essentially what a discipline is a focused magical way. Is a focused way of using magic to achieve a particular goal, and we'll go into more specifically what that means in a from a conceptual philosophical standpoint in a later episode.
Yeah.
But the idea is that everybody uses magic. Is that the thief is not just sneaky; he is magically thickening the shadows around him. The troubadour is applying some of the epic tale telling that you can recognize from myth and legend of the past, and that's there is a lot of, by like 1 or 2 degrees removed, a lot of inspiration in some ways that is taken from old myth and legend in terms of what these, larger than life heroes were capable of doing. Whether you're talking about, the classic sort of like Greco-Roman tales of Heracles and Jason and the Argonauts and stuff like that,
yes.
Or more Celtic myth with like Cuchulainn, or some of the Norse sagas and stuff like that, where you've got these larger than life figures, and their epic tales and things that they do. There's a lot of that inspiration built in without being directly, this is a like game where you are playing
the 47 Ronin, from ancient China. Yeah, I find the comparison as anybody can pick up a sword and swing it. If you have talent, it's a different thing, but it's every discipline in Earthdawn is slightly on a higher level of existence because they have tapped into the magic that permeates them, like the Force does in Star Wars for the Jedi.
Yeah, that's
you're
kind of
viewing
thinking
all of this magic inside you for every single thing you do. Almost.
Yeah, that in a sense, what you've got is sort of almost a dozen different flavors of Jedi that you can play.
There's your elevator pitch right there.
Yeah. A dozen, there's actually more, but a dozen different flavors of Jedi, all of whose force powers are devoted to meeting a particular archetype. Yes. Because as we go through the various disciplines, we'll kind of talk about what the archetypes of each of them are, and the types of characters that they typically represent.
Yeah, and we'll get a
But-
more focused view on those one at a time as we go
Yeah.
as we go through the next few episodes.
Absolutely.
So, since we've covered legends and threads and magic, this brings us to what we just talked about, the actual disciplines themselves and the concepts, because in D&D and other games, they're called classes just because you can identify, oh, that guy's this and that guy's this. In Earthdawn, it's more than just this is what my job is. This is what I do. I wake up every day with this thought. I go to bed every night with this thought, and I focus my life around this set of talents and this way of living and this defined goal ahead of me in Earthdawn.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a very strong philosophical undercurrent that basically, in order to unlock the magic that allows you to do the awesome stuff that you do as an adventurer in Earthdawn, you really need to be devoting your life to a specific sort of philosophical framework that you need to approach and view the world a certain way. And the degree to which you can do that in your game varies.
Yes.
There is, and the exact avenue by which you do that can also vary. I am by no means a purist when it comes to what your character's philosophical outlook is, as long as it mostly makes sense. But yeah, that there's very definitely like the classic example, because it's the one that's sort of made easiest to understand, is the archer, where the stereotypical philosophy of the archer is by viewing everything in the world as either a target or a missile with which you can hit your target. And that is not just a literal situation where you are talking about, shooting people in the eye with an arrow. You are talking about, we need to find out where the bandits took the chieftain's daughter. And so the way that so the target is the information, and the arrow is, we will go to the bar that the bandits hang out in, and we will basically ask there. But basically approaching every problem with an outlook of, I am an archer, and so I am very direct and very, to the point and very perceptive and things like that. That's the iconic one. And there, again, it is not the only way to do it. There are variations, and so there's that very sort of iconic and clear to understand presentation of that, with the archer as looking at the world and approaching problems and everything in a particular way. It's not the only way to do it. It's not the only way that archers can do it necessarily, but it is something that is, again, sort of a role-playing and at the same time a setting aspect. And that's actually one other thing that a lot of fans of Earthdawn like to call out. I try not to get into it too much with newer people because it can be a bit daunting. But
yes,
there are a lot of things that in many games are just rules conceits that don't really have any kind of objective reality within the game. That is not the case with disciplines in Earthdawn. That a discipline is something that actually exists and is recognized within the setting of the game. And so someone can talk about being an archer and it actually means something. And as well, circles, which are sort of the Earthdawn equivalent of levels, if you're familiar with the D&D paradigm, are actually something that are recognized. That as you become more powerful, you are recognized as such by your peers and superiors, and you advance through circles. And so saying that you are a third circle archer actually has some kind of meaning and within the setting, which is, again, like a really nice little bit of how Earthdawn takes a lot of the stereotypical fantasy tropes of D&D and puts them within a setting where they all make sense and have a reason to exist.
I agree. And I liken, pardon me, sorry about that. I equate the circles to new players as like a belt system in martial arts. You start with white belt, yellow belt, green belt, so on and so forth up the scale. And so if you're like a 3rd degree black belt, that means more than just being a yellow belt novice in martial arts. So when newbies come along for Earthdawn, I describe disciplines as the higher plane of existence than just anybody else who can do who thinks that they can do what they can do. And the circles are like the belt system in martial arts. So the higher up you go, more it means. And you can identify yourself as that when you meet somebody new in the game. Your character can actually say, I am a 4th circle and I follow the path of the warrior. Or I am a 5th circle and I follow the path of the scout. And that means something to the layperson 9 times out of 10, and they can go along with that. So a discipline is more than just I fight bad guys or I do X, Y, and Z. It's, no, this is my life. This is my calling. This is what I do.
Yeah. And there has been, again, looking at the sort of back and forth influence where, Earthdawn is in many ways a response to 2nd edition Dungeons and Dragons. A lot of like the later fleshing out of Dungeons and Dragons style fantasy that you see with the different flavors of spellcaster, like sorcerer and warlock and things like that in Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder and similar games, is taking some of that influence and inspiration and having them be more of a setting reality, compared to previous iterations. So again, it's all back and forth. There's nothing bad about the other stuff. It's all cool.
Yeah, fair enough. You play what you want, but we want you to play Earthdawn. So that pretty much covers our overall broad strokes on the setting, how disciplines are different than classes, how magic is different in Earthdawn versus everything else, and why legends are important. So is there any basic mechanical overview we should cover in the next 3 to 4 or 5, 10 minutes?
So I recall hearing that. So first off, I can completely understand how some people might bounce off of the mechanics of Earthdawn. I think it's an elegant little system. I think at its most basic, it's pretty easy, but can be a little bit complex.
Crunchy.
It can be a little bit crunchy. It can be maybe a little bit difficult. I think the floor of sort of the rules mechanics is a little bit higher than it is in say D&D, where it's just roll a d20 and add this to it. But I think that there are some strengths to the Earthdawn system that overcome the weaknesses of the straight d20 system, just in terms of scalability. The basic idea is that everything in Earthdawn is built around what are called steps. Hence, it's basically referred to as the step system, or sometimes core step. And that is that basically everything has a rating. And if you are familiar with games like Deadlands or Savage Worlds or Cortex, you will have seen similar concepts. We talked about this last episode, where, basically the more skilled you are, the larger the die that you roll. But basically in Earthdawn, it's a attribute plus skill system. Your attribute has a step value. Your skill or talent, as it's most of the abilities in Earthdawn are, also has a step value, and you basically add those together to determine your final step. So if your strength is a step 5, and you are doing something that adds on. You've got rank
Melee
3
weapons.
in it.
Strength.
I mean,
Yeah.
but like, so
Punching.
Dexterity is step 5.
Yes.
And you are trying to hit somebody with a sword, so you've got melee weapons at rank 3. Your 5 plus your 3 is an 8. You look up on your chart what the 8 represents, means you're going to be rolling 2d6. I mean, that's basically how everything works, is you basically find out, based on what you're adding together, what step you're going to roll. You roll the relevant dice. If you roll, and you add them together to generate a single total. If any single die in your roll is the maximum value, you re-roll and add. So they are open-ended, and theoretically, if you keep rolling really well, you can get incredibly high results, even if you're just rolling like a single d10. But basically, you have your sort of single dice to start off, and then you get into multiple dice. And it is the step of looking up the dice that you need on the chart, point at which some people bounce off the system, especially when you start looking at things that have modifiers, because the idea is, at least as the system is originally conceived, that modifiers, rather than modifying the result of the roll, change the dice. So if you are normally on a step 8, but you're doing something that gives you a +2 bonus, you're actually going to roll a step 10, which means you need to roll the dice for that instead of rolling your step 8 dice and just adding 2. If you've got a -1 penalty and you're on a step 8, you drop down to a 7, so instead of 2d6, you're rolling a d12. Again, you're modifying the dice that you roll, not the step. And that can be, for people newer to the system, a little bit daunting, because then you're always needing to refer to the table that shows you what dice you need to roll. And that can, with people newer to the system, be a little bit time consuming and frustrating and difficult, especially once you start factoring in all kinds of various modifiers and special abilities that can add on to stuff and whatnot. So again, I can understand why people might find it a little crunchy. I can understand why people might bounce off of it. The skill floor of playing is higher than it is in some other games, but I think mechanically, and I've written articles on this, and I'll link them link to them in the show notes, but basically analyzing the step system and how mathematically it is a great looking system. And major props to Greg Gordon, who was one of the key architects of its design back in the first edition. Greg Gordon has actually done some other really great game design work. I think he was one of the brains behind the old DC Heroes game from back in the late 80s or early 90s. But yeah, he's done a couple of designs like that. But the step system is just fantastic, and once you've got it once you understand what's going on and are comfortable enough with it to be able to do stuff with it, it's a great system. I really, really like it.
No, that was one of my selling points on it, is that, to your point, you add the step number to the step number, and not my dexterity is a D6 and my talent is a D4. I'm going to add those two together and roll my D6 and D4. That's not how it works, because that mathematically does not help you, whereas adding the step number, and the step number gets you bigger dice to roll, and so that mathematically does work in your favor. And so that's why I had to convince people. I said, don't just take that attribute die and don't take this talent die and roll them together. That's not how this works. If you take the step number and the step number and put those together and get a new step number with new dice, that's what works better in your favor. That's where it's more open-ended, and the chance of accomplishing your task is easier rather than harder. And then it's more open-ended because you have the exploding dice, where you, like I said, take the maximum, keep rolling. And to a point I think we talked about offline, I had a player in the very second game I ran who tried something as a warrior, did not hit with his sword, he got knocked out of his hand, and he picked up a shield and tried to hit somebody with it as an unskilled attempt. I said, you have a D4. That is it. And he maxed that sucker 8 times. And he rolled a 33 on a single D4, and it was over. That was it. And he absolutely fell in love with the game. He said, I'm just going to keep rolling this D4 all night long. And that's the open-ended part of it.
Yeah, that is usually the point where people new to Earthdawn, when I'm running it at conventions, that is usually the point where people fall in love, because enough dice get rolled that somebody is going to get some kind of ridiculously high result off of their dice, and the person who did it will absolutely love it, and generally other people will as well. But there are enough opportunities where that is likely to happen for almost everybody at the table at some point during the session, and it is usually at that point where they fall in love with the game, recognizing that, oh, hey, I'm only a first circle character. I'm only a first circle or a second circle character because I tend to run the games with, run intro games with lower circle characters because they're easier to manage. But I'm still rolling a 43 for my damage, and I took that thing out in one hit. Like, basically, those are the moments around which the tables get like the table tales get told. You know, those amazing results that crop up, and you know, those form memories, and the memories form bonds, and those stories get retold, and that's where people tend to really get hooked on the game.
Exactly. So, the story I just told you is literally 19 years old.
Yeah.
And we kept a tally about which step number rolled the highest amount of die, or rolled the highest result. And I think the highest we ever got was somebody pulled off a 69 as a roll on a single D12.
Wow. Yeah.
No karma die, no nothing. Just single D12 was all they had.
I know
step 7 for that.
I know that in one of my campaigns, the players actually were keeping track of what their highest rolls just overall were.
Yeah.
Like having his little notes on their character sheet. It's like, this was the highest that I had rolled. And, I beat it. Oh, yay. And
now I beat it.
The other one that I remember was one of the first campaigns that I ran. One of my players, their goal was to be the first player to be rolling, I think it was to be rolling 4 dice on a test. Mm-hmm. Maybe it was 5. Like, he was really I think it was 4 though. Like, to be the first person in the group that was rolling 4 dice on something.
Wow.
Because that got him to the 2d20, the d20 plus 2d6.
Yep.
I think was what it was, and then he had the karma die that he could throw in with that.
Of course.
It was like shooting for 4 or 5 dice, but yeah, that was one of his goals, to be rolling that many dice. And
it's still one of my goals. And I remember that once you understand the step system, it lives in your veins. So I remember playing in other games where, since the step system has lived in us for so long, we're playing other games rolling dice going, if only those were Earthdawn dice and we could add to those results, we'd love it more. But we can't because it's not Earthdawn. So we kind of go from there. That being said, I think we've reached kind of our limit for this week on what we're talking about. We've covered the setting, the goal of playing Earthdawn versus other games, the disciplines, the magic, the legends that make it different than all the other games you can probably find, especially rolled all into one. And we've hit our basic mechanical overview on the step system, which is the backbone of everything Earthdawn. Anything else we need to cover at all before next week?
No, I think that gives us a really good kind of broad overview here. Stuff that we find special and unique about Earthdawn and can be used by people to perhaps entice others into the glory that is what is general. I mean, it was actually, I think, Pyramid magazine called Earthdawn was basically like one of the most underrated games of the 90s. Pyramid magazine from Steve Jackson Games, when they were still producing that. But like, I mean, it's one of those games that like there are people who don't like it. And again, I talked about, bouncing off the system or whatever, which is fine. And it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it is probably one of the best games that not enough people have heard of.
I agree. Just for the setting, just for the characters, the races, which we'll get into later, the treasures, the way magic works, the bad guys, all of them, from the dragons to the horrors to everybody. Well, dragons aren't bad guys. To the mechanics.
Well, they're not exactly good guys either, but we can talk about that
independently motivated characters. We'll go with that.
They are characters. Yeah, that's
they are. To the mechanics. So overall, I think Earthdawn has the best balance of everything in the mix. If you want to do a political game, you can. If you want to do a high fantasy, you can. If you want to do a nice little charming tale about one little tiny village and make it a character piece, you can do that as well. It's basically, I can say unlimited, because there's no laser guns and cars, but it's for the setting and for the design of it, I don't think there's anything that can really match it toe to toe across the board. So
no.
Anyway, we're huge fans. That brings us to almost 55 minutes for the episode. We ran a tad long, and with technical difficulties, we'll kind of smooth those out before this goes to press. Other than that, folks, that covers us for this episode. If you want to hear more in-depth discussions or what we talked about today, contact us with your questions at edsgpodcast@gmail.com. I want to thank Josh again for making the time to do the podcast and all the stumbles and starts we had today and the colds that we're both getting over. Apologize for the voices. Sorry about that. And definitely, Josh, thank you for keeping the Earthdawn light burning for all of us.
Yeah. Couple of quick sort of announcements here to wrap up. Since our first episode went live, we actually are now available on multiple podcast platforms. Right now, we can be found on Anchor, which is our host. But in addition, we are also now on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, also some lesser ones, Breaker, Pocket Cast, and Radio Public, and I'm sure there will be more that we will be available on here as the weeks go on. So, hey, if you like what you're hearing, give us a rating, give us a review, get the word out so that we can get more people on. We actually had a pretty good response to the first episode, and we hope to see that continue. So we appreciate your time listening. We know that there's a lot of stuff that you could be doing. And spending an hour listening to us gab about this is, we appreciate you
rewarding
doing it.
for us. Thank you for listening, everybody. Now, go make your own legend. We'll see you next time.